Sometimes the most broken souls recognize each other. In 1874, a lone cowboy named Elias Hart walked into a frontier town and did something nobody could understand. He bought a wolf that everyone feared would kill him. The animal had been caged, starved, and beaten by a traveling showman who called it a monster. The townsfolk warned Elias to stay away. They said the wolf was too wild, too dangerous, too far gone. But Elias saw something in those yellow eyes that others couldn't see, a reflection of his own pain, his own scars from a war that never left him. What happens when a man who's lost everything risks his life to save a creature the world has given up on? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days before Elias Hart would make the decision that changed everything, he stood in the doorway of Martha Jenkins' boarding house and watched the sun rise over Redemption Creek. The town had earned its name honestly. It was where men came to forget, to start over, to bury whatever they'd been before. Elias understood that better than most. The air smelled of wood smoke and the promise of autumn. September in Montana Territory carried a particular quality, a crispness that made everything seem both more vivid and more distant at once. Elias had arrived here 6 weeks ago with little more than the clothes on his back, a worn saddlebag, and a cavalry saber he couldn't bring himself to sell or throw away. The saber hung now in his rented room, wrapped in oilcloth, collecting dust beneath his narrow bed. He was 42 years old and looked every day of it. His face was weathered leather, creased at the eyes and mouth from years of squinting into harsh sunlight and harsher truths. His hair, once dark as crow feathers, had gone grey at the temples. His hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who'd worked with them all his life, first in violence, then in penance. Martha appeared behind him, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a sturdy woman in her 50s, widowed by the war, same as half the women in the territory. "Coffee's on," she said, her voice carrying the same practical kindness she showed to all her boarders. "You're up early again?" "Old habits," Elias said, stepping aside to let her pass. "Old habits from the war, you mean?" It wasn't a question. Martha had a way of seeing through people that made lying pointless. "Sheriff Whitmore says you served together. Says you were one of the best cavalry officers in the Montana Volunteers." Elias didn't respond. He'd learned that silence often said more than words, and Martha was wise enough to let it lie. She poured them both coffee from the pot she kept perpetually warm on the stove, and they stood together in the quiet morning, watching the town wake up. Redemption Creek wasn't much to look at. A single main street ran north to south, flanked by wooden buildings that had weathered to the color of old bones. The general store, the saloon, the blacksmith, the doctor's office, the sheriff's office, the church, all the necessities of frontier life arranged in tidy rows. Beyond the town limits, the land opened up into rolling grassland that stretched toward mountains so distant they seemed like blue ghosts on the horizon. It was a good place to disappear. Elias had been disappearing for 10 years now, ever since the war ended, and he'd come home to an empty house and 2 graves behind it. His wife, Catherine, had died of consumption in the winter of 1863. His daughter, Mary, just 7 years old, had followed her mother 3 months later. By the time Elias had mustered out and made it back to their farm in Ohio, the neighbors had already buried them and sold off most of his possessions to cover debts. He'd stood at those graves for 3 days, unable to move, unable to think, unable to feel anything but a hollowness so profound it seemed impossible his body could still contain it. Then he'd walked away and kept walking. He'd worked ranches in Wyoming, logged in Oregon, prospected half-heartedly in Nevada. He'd never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots, never formed attachments that might anchor him to one place or one purpose. Redemption Creek was just another stop. He'd taken a job doing carpentry work for Jonas Mitchell, who owned the lumber mill on the creek's North Fork. The work was steady and mindless, repairing water-damaged buildings, constructing new storage sheds, replacing rotted fence posts. Elias was good with his hands and didn't complain about wages, which made him popular with employers, if not with fellow workers. The other men at the mill didn't quite know what to make of him. He didn't drink with them after shifts, didn't share stories or jokes, didn't play cards on Saturday nights. He was polite but distant, helpful but unknowable. Some thought him arrogant, others thought him broken. Both were partly right. Sheriff Tom Whitmore was the only person in Redemption Creek who knew Elias from before. They'd served in the same cavalry unit during the war, Whitmore as a sergeant, Elias as a lieutenant. They'd fought together in half a dozen engagements, watched men die in ways that defied clean description, done things that seemed necessary at the time and unforgivable in hindsight. Whitmore had been the one to suggest, "Elias, try Redemption Creek, good people here." He'd written in a brief letter that found Elias in a mining camp outside Virginia City. "Quiet place. Could use a man with your skills." No questions asked about the past. That last part had been the selling point. Elias didn't want to talk about the past. He wanted to work until his body was too tired to dream, eat simple meals, sleep in a clean bed, and wake up each morning without having to decide whether it was worth the effort. But even here, even in this place designed for men who wanted to forget, the past had a way of catching up. 3 nights ago, Elias had been working late at the mill when he'd heard a commotion from town. Raised voices, the sound of a wagon rattling down the main street, someone shouting about a show. He'd ignored it and kept planing boards until the light was too poor to continue. When he'd walked back to Martha's boarding house, he'd passed Doc Harrison standing outside his office, smoking a pipe and watching the activity in front of the saloon. "Traveling show rolled in," Doc said by way of greeting. He was a thin man, with wire-rimmed spectacles, and the careful manner of someone who'd spent a lifetime delivering bad news gently. "Augustus Crane and his wilderness wonders. They've got some kind of wild animal they're displaying." "That's so," Elias said, not particularly interested. "Wolf, apparently. A big one. Crane claims it killed 2 men in Colorado." Doc drew on his pipe, the ember glowing briefly in the dusk. "Seems cruel keeping an animal caged like that. But people love a spectacle." Elias had nodded and moved on. He'd seen enough cruelty during the war to last several lifetimes. He had no interest in paying money to watch more of it dressed up as entertainment. But something about the conversation stuck with him. That night, lying in his narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling around him, he'd found himself thinking about that caged wolf. He'd seen wolves in the wild during his years of drifting, magnificent creatures, powerful and free, perfectly adapted to the harsh land they called home. The idea of one trapped in a cage, put on display for gawking crowds, struck him as fundamentally wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Still, he'd told himself it wasn't his concern. He'd learned long ago that the world was full of injustices, large and small, and one man couldn't fix them all. The best you could do was mind your own business and try not to add to the sum total of suffering. That philosophy had served him well enough for a decade. It was easier to drift through life without attachments, without causes, without the weight of other people's expectations. He'd become a ghost, present but not quite real, existing in the spaces between other people's lives without ever truly touching them. Martha had noticed, of course. She noticed everything. "You ever think about settling down properly?" she'd asked him one evening over dinner. "Maybe buy a piece of land, build something permanent?" "No," Elias had said, and that was the truth. The idea of permanence terrified him more than any physical danger. Permanence meant vulnerability. It meant caring about something enough that its loss could hurt you. He'd learned that lesson in the most painful way possible, and he had no intention of repeating it. "That's a lonely way to live," Martha had observed, not unkindly. "I've made peace with it," Elias had replied, and that was partly true. He'd made a kind of peace with his isolation, the way you might make peace with a chronic injury, accepting it as the permanent price of earlier wounds. Now, standing in the morning light, with his coffee growing cold in his hands, Elias heard the town beginning to stir. The blacksmith's hammer started its rhythmic clanging. Voices carried from the general store as the proprietor opened up for business. A wagon rolled past, its wheels creaking against the dry earth. Somewhere out there, in a cage he hadn't even seen yet, a wolf waited. Elias didn't know why that thought bothered him so much. Perhaps it was the parallel Doc Harrison had inadvertently drawn. The idea of a powerful creature reduced to a spectacle, broken and displayed for entertainment. Perhaps it was something deeper, some recognition he couldn't yet name. He finished his coffee and set the cup on the porch rail. "Thank you for the breakfast, Martha." "You didn't eat anything," she pointed out. "Not hungry this morning?" She studied him with that penetrating gaze of hers. "You all right, Elias? You seem more distant than usual, and that's saying something." "I'm fine," he said, which was the answer he always gave. "Just thinking. Dangerous occupation, thinking." But she smiled when she said it, and Elias found himself almost smiling back. He spent that day working at the mill, his mind elsewhere. His hands knew the work well enough that they moved almost independently, measuring, cutting, sanding, fitting pieces together with practiced precision. Jonas Mitchell complimented him on his craftsmanship, said he'd never had a worker who paid such close attention to detail. Elias accepted the praise with a nod and kept working. Attention to detail had kept him alive during the war. It had saved his life more than once, noticing the glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel, hearing the subtle change in a horse's gait that indicated injury, reading the landscape for signs of ambush. Those skills had transferred well to carpentry, where precision mattered and mistakes showed up in wobbly joints and uneven surfaces. By evening, when the light grew too poor for fine work, Elias cleaned his tools and prepared to head back to the boarding house. That was when Sheriff Whitmore appeared, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight. "Elias," he said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of an old friend who wasn't sure of his welcome. "Got a minute?" They sat on the mill's loading dock, feet dangling over the edge, and watched the creek flow past. It was the same position they'd assumed countless times during the war, sitting on whatever flat surface was available and stealing moments of peace between campaigns. "I wanted to warn you," Whitmore said after a long silence. "That your crane's been running. It's gotten ugly. The wolf he's got, it's in bad shape, real bad. People have been complaining about the cruelty of it, but Crane claims it's all legal. Says the animal's dangerous, and he's providing a public service by showing folks what's out there. Why are you telling me this?" Elias asked. Whitmore turned to look at him, and there was something sad in his eyes. "Because I know you, Elias. I know how you think, and I'm worried you're going to do something foolish. I haven't even seen the animal, but you're thinking about it. I can tell. You've got that look you used to get during the war, right before you'd volunteer for some damn fool mission nobody else wanted." Whitmore shook his head. "That wolf isn't your responsibility. It's not your redemption to seek." The word hung in the air between them, redemption. It was the first time either of them had spoken it aloud, though it had been present in every interaction since Elias arrived. "I'm not seeking anything," Elias said quietly. "I'm just trying to get through each day. I know, but sometimes trying to save something broken is just another way of punishing ourselves." Whitmore stood, brushing sawdust from his trousers. "Just think about what I said. That's all I ask." After he left, Elias sat alone in the gathering darkness, listening to the creek and thinking about broken things. He thought about the cavalry saber under his bed, a weapon he couldn't use but couldn't release. He thought about Catherine and Mary, their faces growing hazier in his memory with each passing year. He thought about the man he'd been before the war, younger, more certain, full of plans and dreams that seemed embarrassingly naive now, and he thought about a wolf in a cage, and what it meant to be trapped by circumstances beyond your control, defined by other people's fears and expectations. Reduced to something less than what you were meant to be. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would see this traveling show for himself. Then he would know whether Tom Whitmore's warning was justified, or whether this was simply another cruelty he would witness and walk away from, adding it to the long list of things he'd learned to ignore in order to survive. He didn't yet know that tomorrow would change everything. That the moment he looked into those yellow eyes, he would recognize something he thought he'd lost forever, the possibility of connection, of purpose, of caring about something outside himself again, but deep down, in a place he rarely acknowledged, he suspected. And that suspicion both terrified and compelled him in equal measure. The crowd had already gathered by the time Elias made his way to the town square the next afternoon. He'd finished his work early, telling Jonas Mitchell he had business to attend to, which wasn't exactly a lie. This felt like business, though he couldn't have explained why. Augustus Crane stood on a makeshift platform, constructed from wagon boards and barrel tops, his arms spread wide in theatrical welcome. He was a portly man in his 50s, dressed in a garish red coat with brass buttons and a top hat that had seen better days. His face was flushed with excitement and whiskey, and his voice carried across the square with the practiced projection of a carnival barker. "Ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages, step right up and witness one of nature's most fearsome predators." Crane gestured dramatically towards something behind him, hidden beneath a canvas top. "I've traveled from the Colorado territories to bring you this marvel. A genuine timber wolf, captured after it killed 2 prospectors in a mining camp outside Denver." The crowd pressed closer. Elias hung back near the edge, near the general store's porch, where he could observe without being noticed. He recognized most of the faces: shopkeepers and their families, ranch hands, the school teacher Miss Peterson with a group of wide-eyed children. Even Martha was there, looking more skeptical than impressed. "This beast," Crane continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow carried to every ear, "is known among the miners as the Grey Devil. It stalked their camps for weeks, stealing food, frightening horses, and finally tragically taking human life." He paused for effect. "It took 6 armed men to bring this monster to justice, and even then, 3 were injured in the capture." Elias felt a familiar skepticism rise in his chest. He'd heard enough tall tales during his years of drifting to recognize when someone was embellishing truth into fiction. But the crowd ate it up, gasping and murmuring among themselves. With a flourish, Crane yanked away the canvas tarp. The cage beneath was constructed of iron bars, roughly 6 feet square and 5 feet high, barely large enough for the animal inside to turn around. The wolf lay on its side in a corner, its breathing shallow and labored. Even from a distance, Elias could see the prominent ridges of its ribs, the matted, dirt-caked fur, the old scars crisscrossing its body. But it was the eyes that caught him. As if sensing Elias's attention, the wolf lifted its head and looked directly at him. Its eyes were the color of gold in firelight, and in them Elias saw something he hadn't expected, not rage or wildness, but a profound, weary resignation. The look of something that had fought as hard as it could and finally accepted defeat. He knew that look. He'd seen it in mirrors for the past 10 years. "As you can see," Crane was saying, producing a long leather bullwhip from behind the platform, "this creature must be handled with the utmost caution. Observe how it responds to the mere presence of discipline." He cracked the whip in the air, the sound sharp as a gunshot. The wolf flinched but didn't move otherwise. Its ears flattened against its skull, but there was no snarl, no show of aggression, just a subtle shrinking back that spoke of conditioning and repeated punishment. "Now watch," Crane said, and he thrust the whip through the bars, striking the wolf's flank. The animal let out a sound somewhere between a yelp and a snarl, scrambling to the opposite corner of the cage. Blood welled from where the leather had split old wounds. The crowd gasped, some in horror, others in morbid fascination. Something crystallized in Elias's chest, a cold, hard anger that pushed through the numbness he'd cultivated so carefully. He'd seen cruelty before, participated in it during the war, when orders demanded and survival required it. But this was different. This was cruelty for entertainment, suffering commodified and sold for pocket change. "That's enough," Sheriff Whitmore's voice cut through the crowd. He'd moved forward, his hand resting on his sidearm, in a gesture that wasn't quite a threat, but wasn't exactly friendly either. "We don't tolerate animal cruelty in this town, show or no show," Crane's smile never wavered. With all due respect, Sheriff, I'm operating within the law. This is a dangerous animal being safely displayed to educate the public about frontier hazards. The discipline you witnessed is necessary to prevent injury. Looked like torture to me, Martha said loudly, and several people murmured agreement. Then perhaps, Crane said smoothly, someone would like to purchase this magnificent specimen and care for it themselves. I'm prepared to part with the Grey Devil for the modest sum of $50 in gold. It was an absurd price, more than most men in Redemption Creek made in 2 months. Gray knew it, and the offer was clearly meant to shut down criticism. No one in their right mind would pay that kind of money for a half-starved wolf that might die within a week anyway. Elias stepped forward. The crowd parted around him without conscious thought, perhaps sensing something in his bearing that commanded space. He walked straight to the platform and met Crane's eyes. "I'll take him," he said quietly. The square fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Crane's smile widened, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "I'm sorry, did you say $50 in gold?" "I'll pay it now." Elias reached into his coat pocket and produced a small leather pouch. It represented most of his savings from 6 weeks of steady work. Money he'd been setting aside for no particular reason beyond old habits of thrift. He weighed it in his hand, then tossed it to Crane, who caught it reflexively. "Elias, no," Sheriff Whitmore started, but Elias held up a hand. "My money, my decision." Crane opened the pouch and counted the coins with practiced efficiency. His expression shifted from theatrical surprise to genuine astonishment. "Well, I'll be damned. A deal is a deal, then. The wolf is yours, sir." He gestured toward the cage. "Though I'd recommend extreme caution. As I said, this animal is—" "I heard what you said." Elias turned to examine the cage more closely. The lock was a simple affair, the bars solid but showing rust at the joints. The whole structure was mounted on a wheeled cart, meant to be drawn by horses. "I'll need help transporting this to the old barn on the Mitchell property. That's half a mile from town," Doc Harrison said, stepping forward from the crowd. His face was grave with concern. "Elias, I appreciate the sentiment here, but Tom's right. This is dangerous. That animal is sick, starving, and traumatized. It's as likely to kill you as to let you help it. Maybe." Elias looked back at the wolf, which was watching the exchange with those unsettling, intelligent eyes. "But I'm not asking permission, Doc. I'm asking for help with the cart." A long moment passed. Then Jonas Mitchell cleared his throat. "I'll help. It's my barn he's using, after all. And my horses can pull the cart. I'll come too," Martha said firmly. "Someone needs to make sure you don't do anything stupid without witnesses." Sheriff Whitmore sighed heavily, the sound of a man accepting the inevitable. "Fine, but I'm coming armed, and if that animal shows any sign of aggression, I'm putting it down." "Understood?" "Understood," Elias said, though they both knew he had no intention of letting that happen. It took an hour to organize the transport. Crane handed over the cage key with exaggerated warnings about the wolf's dangerous nature, pocketed his gold, and departed with his wagon before anyone could reconsider. Several townspeople followed the cart out of morbid curiosity, though most dispersed once it became clear nothing dramatic was going to happen immediately. The barn stood at the edge of Mitchell's property, a weathered structure used primarily for storing lumber and equipment. Elias had been renting the attached room for its privacy and quiet. Now he directed Mitchell and Whitmore to position the cart in the barn's center, where the light was good and the space was secure. Throughout the journey, the wolf hadn't made a sound. It lay in its corner of the cage, conserving energy, its eyes tracking every movement around it. When they finally settled the cart and stepped back, those golden eyes fixed on Elias with an intensity that made Martha shiver. "What now?" she asked. "You can't just leave it locked in there forever." "No," Elias agreed. He approached the cage slowly, his hands visible, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "But rushing this would be worse. He needs food, water, and time. Mostly time. You're assuming it's male," Doc Harrison observed. Elias corrected, still watching the wolf. "His name is going to be Ghost. You've already named it, Whitmore said flatly. Elias, you bought this animal 3 hours ago. Sometimes you just know. Elias knelt a few feet from the cage, putting himself at eye level with the wolf. Don't you, boy? Sometimes you know when something matters. For a long moment, man and wolf simply looked at each other. Then so subtly that Elias might have imagined it, the wolf's ears shifted forward a fraction of an inch, not aggression, but attention, interest maybe, or perhaps just the faintest beginning of something that might eventually become trust. I'll bring food, Martha said softly. Meat scraps from the butcher, and water, thank you. One by one the others left, until only Elias remained in the barn with the wolf he'd named Ghost. The afternoon light slanted through gaps in the walls, painting golden stripes across the hay-strewn floor. Somewhere outside, a meadowlark sang its evening song. Elias settled onto a bale of hay and pulled out the small knife he used for carving. He'd been working on a piece of pine, slowly transforming it into something that might eventually resemble a bird. It was mindless work, something to occupy his hands while his thoughts wandered. I don't know what I'm doing, he said quietly, not looking at the wolf. In case you're wondering, I've never trained an animal, never even had a dog growing up. This is probably the dumbest thing I've done in a decade. Ghost's breathing continued, steady and shallow. If the wolf found Elias's confession interesting, it gave no sign. But I couldn't walk away, Elias continued, wood shavings falling at his feet. I don't know why. Maybe because I know what it's like, being trapped, being hurt, having everyone look at you like you're already dead. He paused in his carving, memory rising unbidden. My daughter loved animals. She used to bring home injured birds, try to nurse them back to health. Usually they died anyway, but she never stopped trying. Said every creature deserved someone to care whether they lived or died. The barn grew darker as the sun sank toward the horizon. Elias lit a lantern and hung it from a post, casting warm light over the space. Ghost's eyes reflected the flame, twin points of amber in the darkness. So here we are, Elias said. Two broken things in a barn, neither one sure what comes next. But tomorrow, I'm going to open that cage, Ghost, and then we'll see what you're really made of, and maybe what I'm made of too. He didn't expect an answer, and he didn't get one. But he stayed there through the night anyway, carving his piece of wood and talking occasionally to the wolf that watched him with ancient, knowing eyes. And if Ghost's breathing eventually synchronized with his own, settling into a shared rhythm of existence, neither of them acknowledged it. Not yet. Dawn broke cold and grey, mist rising from the creek to blanket the valley in ghostly white. Elias woke stiff from sleeping upright against a hay bale, his neck protesting as he rolled his shoulders. Ghost was awake too, watching him with that same steady, unreadable gaze. Morning, Elias said, his voice rough from disuse. He stood slowly, giving the wolf time to adjust to his movement. Ghost's ears twitched, but he showed no other reaction. Martha arrived with breakfast, for both of them. She'd brought oatmeal and coffee for Elias, and raw beef scraps wrapped in butcher paper for Ghost. Tom Henderson said to tell you these were going to the dogs anyway, she explained, setting the package on a workbench. He's curious about your wolf, but too smart to say so out loud. Appreciate it. Elias took the coffee gratefully, letting the warmth seep into his hands. What's the town saying? About what you'd expect. Half think you're touched in the head. The other half are taking bets on how long before that animal tears your throat out. Martha gave him a measuring look. For what it's worth, I'm in neither camp. What camp are you in? The one that thinks you're trying to save something you couldn't save before. She said it gently, without judgment. And I hope you succeed, Elias. I truly do. After she left, Elias stood before the cage with the meat in his hands. This was the first test. Would Ghost accept food from him, or had Crane's cruelty destroyed that basic trust? He knelt slowly, making himself smaller and less threatening. Then he carefully pushed the meat through the bars, using a flat piece of wood to slide it within Ghost's reach. The wolf didn't move. It's all right, Elias said softly. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. He backed away several feet and settled onto his hay bale, sipping his coffee and pretending not to watch. It took nearly 10 minutes, but eventually Ghost's hunger overcame his wariness. Moving slowly, stiffly, the wolf crawled forward and took the meat delicately in his jaws. He didn't gulp it down. Instead, he retreated to his corner and ate in small, careful bites, as if expecting someone to snatch it away at any moment. "Good boy," Elias murmured, and one of Ghost's ears rotated toward the sound. The water was next. Elias had spent the last hour of darkness carving a shallow bowl from a piece of pine, smoothing it carefully so there were no splinters or rough edges. It wasn't much, crude work compared to what a proper craftsman might produce, but it held water without leaking, and that was all that mattered. He filled it from the pump outside and slid it into the cage the same way he'd delivered the food. Ghost sniffed at it suspiciously before lowering his head to drink. The sound of lapping water was surprisingly loud in the quiet barn. Elias felt something unknot in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. This creature was eating and drinking. That meant there was still something alive in there, something willing to survive despite everything. Over the next 3 days, they fell into a routine. Elias would arrive at dawn with food and fresh water. He'd clean the waste from the cage using a long-handled rake, working slowly and talking quietly the entire time. He'd spend his mornings at the mill, his afternoons and evenings in the barn, sometimes reading aloud from a water-damaged book of poems Martha had lent him, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. Ghost began to fill out slightly, the sharp edges of his bones softening under the regular meals. His breathing grew steadier, his eyes more alert. But he still wouldn't come near the cage bars when Elias was close, still flinched at sudden movements, still carried himself like an animal, expecting punishment. On the 4th day, Doc Harrison made a visit. He examined Ghost from a safe distance, his experienced eyes cataloging injuries and ailments. "He's malnourished, obviously. Probably has parasites, most wild animals do, and captivity would have made it worse. Those scars suggest repeated beatings, maybe burns too." Doc shook his head. "The physical wounds will heal given time and care. The others might not." "The others?" "The ones on the inside. An animal treated like that, it changes them, makes them unpredictable." Doc turned to face Elias directly. "I'm not saying this to discourage you. I can see you're committed, but you need to understand what you're dealing with. That wolf may never fully trust humans again. And the first time you make a mistake, move too fast, speak too loud, anything that triggers those old fears, he could attack." "I know." "Do you?" "Because from where I'm standing, you're getting attached to an animal that might kill you. And if it does, it won't be because he's evil or vicious. It'll be because he's broken, and broken things sometimes cut the people trying to hold them together." Elias thought about the cavalry saber under his bed, about the nightmares that still woke him sweating and gasping, about the way certain sounds, a door slamming, glass breaking, a woman crying, could send him back to places he'd rather forget. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I understand broken things pretty well." Doc was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out a small brown bottle. "Laudanum. Mixed weak for animal use. If you need to sedate him for any reason, injury treatment, that sort of thing, a few drops in his water should do it. But use it sparingly. The last thing that creature needs is another form of dependency." After Doc left, Elias sat with the laudanum bottle in his hands, thinking about dependencies and cages of all kinds. He'd seen enough men during the war turn to drink or opiates to numb their pain, watched them trade one form of captivity for another. He set the bottle on a high shelf where he'd remember it was there but wouldn't see it every day. "Just you and me again," he told Ghost. "Everyone else has opinions about what we're doing here. But opinions don't mean much when you're the ones actually in it, do they?" That evening he took a risk. Instead of sitting on his hay bale, he sat on the floor near the cage, not touching it but closer than he'd been before. Ghost's eyes tracked him warily, body tensing, but he didn't retreat to his corner. "I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "During the war, I got captured by Confederate cavalry. They held me for 3 weeks in a camp in Tennessee. It wasn't like your cage. I could stand up, walk a few feet, but I was chained to a post like an animal. They'd bring me out sometimes, make sport of it. Beatings mostly, nothing compared to what they did to others, but enough. Ghost had gone still, as if listening. What I remember most wasn't the pain. It was the waiting, not knowing when the next blow would come, or if that day would be the day they decided I was more trouble than I was worth. That uncertainty, it got inside my head and stayed there long after I was freed. Elias picked at the wooden floor with his thumbnail. I was lucky. My unit staged a raid and got me out. But even after, I wasn't the same. Couldn't be. Some things change you too deep for healing. He looked at Ghost, really looked at him. But here's what I learned. You don't have to be healed to go on living. You just have to find one small reason to get through each day. And then another, and another after that. Eventually, those days add up to something that starts to feel like a life again. The barn grew dark around them. Elias lit his lantern and pulled out his carving knife, working on a new piece. Nothing specific, just smooth curves and gentle shapes that felt right under his hands. Ghost watched him work, and gradually, incrementally, the tension in the wolf's body began to ease. When Elias finally stood to leave for the night, he paused at the barn door. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'm going to open that cage. Not to let you out. You're not ready, and neither am I. But I need to treat those wounds properly, and I can't do it through bars. So tomorrow, we're going to trust each other a little bit, and we'll see what happens." Ghost's eyes gleamed in the lamplight, feral and ancient and impossibly knowing. If he understood the words, he gave no sign. But when Elias finally closed the barn door behind him, he could have sworn he heard the soft sound of the wolf shifting position. Settling more comfortably onto the old blanket Elias had pushed through the bars the day before. Small things. Small changes. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for now, something was enough. Elias barely slept that night. He lay in his narrow bed at Martha's boarding house, staring at the ceiling and thinking about all the ways opening Ghost's cage could go wrong. The wolf could bolt, could attack, could hurt himself trying to escape through the barn walls, could hurt Elias and give Sheriff Whitmore the excuse he needed to end this experiment with a bullet. But leaving Ghost in that cage indefinitely was its own kind of cruelty, just slower and more insidious than Crane's whip. The wolf needed proper medical attention for those wounds, needed room to move and stretch muscles that had atrophied from confinement, needed to remember, however gradually, what it felt like to be something other than a prisoner. Dawn came too slowly and too fast at once. Elias dressed carefully, pulling on his sturdiest work clothes and the thick leather gloves he used for handling rough lumber. They were scarred and stained from years of use, but they'd stop teeth if it came to that. He hoped it wouldn't come to that. Martha met him in the kitchen with coffee and a worried expression. "You're really doing this?" "I am. Sheriff Whitmore asked me to talk you out of it. Will you?" She studied him for a long moment, then shook her head. "No. I figure a man who survived what you survived has earned the right to make his own mistakes. Just promise me you'll be careful. I promise." The walk to the barn felt longer than usual. The morning was crisp and clear, frost sparkling on the grass like scattered diamonds. A good day for new beginnings, Elias thought, or possibly for endings. He supposed he'd find out which. Ghost was awake when Elias entered, already watching the door as if he'd been expecting him. The wolf's posture was different today, not exactly relaxed, but alert in a way that suggested anticipation rather than fear. "Morning," Elias said, setting down his supplies, bandages Doc Harrison had provided, a tin of salve for wounds, fresh water, and today's breakfast meat. "Today's the day we talked about. I'm going to open this cage, and we're going to see if we can exist in the same space without anyone getting hurt." He approached slowly, the cage key heavy in his gloved hand. Ghost tracked every movement, his golden eyes never leaving Elias's face. When Elias reached the lock, he paused. "I need you to understand something," he said quietly. "I'm not trying to trap you or hurt you. I'm trying to help. But if you come at me, if you give me reason to think you're dangerous, I'll have to defend myself. I don't want that. Neither of us wants that. So let's both be smart about this, all right? Ghost's ears flicked forward, then back. His tail gave a single, almost imperceptible movement. Not quite a wag, but something close to acknowledgement. Elias took a breath and turned the key. The lock opened with a click that seemed deafening in the quiet barn. He pulled the cage door open slowly, its hinges protesting with a squeal of rust and disuse. Then he backed away, giving Ghost space, and settled onto his usual hay bale with his hands visible and non-threatening. For a long time, nothing happened. Ghost remained in his corner, watching the open door as if it might be a trick. His body was tense, coiled like a spring, ready to flee or fight depending on what came next. "Take your time," Elias said. "No rush, the door's open. It's your choice what to do with that." Minutes passed, 5, 10, 15. Elias's legs began to ache from sitting so still, but he didn't move. This was Ghost's moment, and hurrying, it would undo everything they'd built over the past 4 days. Finally, tentatively, Ghost stood. His legs trembled slightly, from weakness or fear, Elias couldn't tell. The wolf moved to the cage opening and paused there, 1 paw inside the cage, 3 outside, as if testing whether the world beyond bars was real or illusion. Then he stepped out. He didn't go far. 2 steps, maybe 3, before he stopped and looked back at Elias with an expression that might have been confusion or might have been wonder. In the better light of the open barn, Elias could see just how damaged the wolf really was. His coat was patchy and dull, hanging loose over prominent bones. The scars were worse than he'd thought, some old and silvered, others fresh and angry red. One ear was torn nearly in half, and his left hind leg carried a limp that suggested old injury never properly healed. "You're a survivor," Elias said softly. "Just like me." Ghost took another step, then another, exploring the barn with cautious curiosity. He sniffed at the hay bales, investigated the corners, marked his territory with the careful deliberation of an animal reclaiming space. Throughout it all, he kept Elias in his peripheral vision, never quite turning his back, never quite letting down his guard. When he finally approached the food Elias had set out, he did so sideways, watching for any sudden movements. He ate more confidently than before, no longer expecting the meal to be snatched away. Progress. After eating, Ghost turned his attention to Elias more directly. He stood about 10 feet away, his posture uncertain, neither aggressive nor submissive, just watchful. "Waiting. All right," Elias said. "Let's see about those wounds." He stood slowly and retrieved the medical supplies. Ghost's hackles rose slightly, a warning, but he didn't retreat. Elias knelt on the floor, making himself smaller and less threatening, and held out one gloved hand, palm up. "This is going to hurt," he admitted. "Some of those cuts need cleaning, and that salve is going to sting. But I promise I'm trying to help, not harm. You're going to have to trust me on that." Ghost stared at the outstretched hand for what felt like hours. Then so slowly it was almost painful to watch, he lowered his head and sniffed Elias's glove. His nose was cold and wet, his breath warm against the leather. When he didn't immediately recoil, Elias carefully, so carefully, raised his other hand and touched the wolf's shoulder. Ghost flinched but held his ground. Under Elias's fingers, he could feel the rapid hammering of the wolf's heart, the tension in every muscle. But Ghost was allowing this. That was the miracle. "Good boy," Elias murmured. "Such a good, brave boy." Working slowly, talking constantly in a low, soothing voice, Elias examined the wounds. Some were infected, as Doc Harrison had predicted. He cleaned them as gently as he could, feeling Ghost tremble under his hands, but never pulling away. When he applied the salve, Ghost whimpered, a sound so small and vulnerable it made Elias's throat tight, but still he stayed. "Almost done," Elias promised. "Just a little more." By the time he finished, they were both shaking. Elias from the tension of waiting for attack that never came. Ghost from the pain of treatment and the terror of letting a human so close. But they'd done it. They'd trusted each other, and neither had betrayed that trust. Elias sat back, pulling off his gloves and tossing them aside. He wouldn't need them anymore. Ghost had shown him something today: restraint, courage, the capacity to overcome instinct in favor of something more complicated. Trust, maybe, or the beginning of it. Ghost retreated a few steps and lowered himself to the floor, his eyes never leaving Elias. His breathing was labored from stress and pain, but there was something different in his posture. Less defeated, more present. You did good, Elias told him. We both did. They stayed that way for hours, sharing the space of the barn in cautious coexistence. Elias carved his wood, the rhythmic scrape of knife against pine, a soothing background noise. Ghost dozed fitfully, waking at intervals to check that Elias was still there, still non-threatening, still trustworthy. When Martha arrived in the afternoon with more food, Ghost scrambled to his feet, his lips pulling back from his teeth in automatic defense. But Elias simply raised a hand, palm out, and said quietly, "Easy." And Ghost, impossibly, wonderfully, listened. His hackles lowered. His lips covered his teeth. He stayed put, watching Martha with suspicion but not aggression. "Well, I'll be damned," Martha said softly. "He's listening to you." "We're learning to listen to each other," Elias corrected. But he couldn't quite suppress the small smile that tugged at his mouth. After Martha left, Elias decided to try something. He stood and walked slowly toward the barn door, then outside into the yard. Ghost watched from the doorway, uncertain. Elias kept walking until he was 20 feet away, then turned and called, "Ghost, come." For a moment, nothing. Then Ghost stepped out into the sunlight. It was the first time the wolf had been outside that cage in who knew how long. He stood blinking in the brightness, his coat catching the light and revealing hints of the silver gray that must have once made him magnificent. He looked toward the open fields beyond the barn, toward freedom and wild places, and Elias held his breath. But Ghost didn't run. Instead, after a long moment, he walked to where Elias stood and sat down beside him, close enough that Elias could have reached out and touched him. They stood together in the autumn sunshine, man and wolf. Two damaged creatures learning that survival and living weren't quite the same thing, and that maybe, just maybe, they could figure out the difference together. Word spread quickly in a town the size of Redemption Creek. Within a week, everyone knew that Elias Hart had not only survived opening the wolf's cage, but had somehow formed a bond with the creature. The reactions ranged from grudging respect to outright fear, with most folks landing somewhere in between. The children were fascinated. They'd sneak to the edge of Mitchell's property, hiding behind trees and fences, hoping to catch a glimpse of the wolf that their parents whispered about. Elias would find them sometimes, clusters of young faces peering through the barn slats, and he'd simply nod at them without chasing them off. Ghost seemed more curious than threatened by the small humans, though he kept his distance. The adults were more problematic. Several ranch owners expressed concern about having a wild predator living so close to town. They worried about livestock, about children, about the precedent it set. Sheriff Whitmore found himself fielding complaints daily. "You're making my job difficult," he told Elias one afternoon, finding him at the creek with Ghost lying nearby in a patch of sunlight. "I'm running out of ways to convince folks you're not harboring a danger to public safety." "He's not dangerous," Elias said, not looking up from the fishing line he was repairing. "You don't know that." "Not for certain." "Hell, Elias, you've had him loose for barely a week. That doesn't mean he's domesticated. I'm not trying to domesticate him. I'm just trying to help him heal." Whitmore sighed and squatted down beside him. "I know, and I admire what you're doing. I really do. But there's talk of a town meeting. People want assurances. They want to know that Animal is under control." "Under control?" Elias finally looked at his old friend. "You mean chained up? Collared like a dog? I mean some visible sign that you're taking responsibility for his actions. If Ghost were to hurt someone—" "He won't. You can't promise that. Can you promise that any man in this town won't hurt someone? Can you promise that you won't?" "That I won't?" Elias set down his fishing line. "We're all capable of violence, Tom. The question is whether we choose it. Ghost is choosing not to, every single day. A philosophical argument isn't going to satisfy worried parents." Elias was quiet for a long moment. Ghost had raised his head at the tension in their voices, his ears pricked forward attentively. When Elias held out a hand, the wolf rose and padded over, sitting close enough that his fur brushed against Elias's leg. "I'll make a compromise," Elias said finally. "I'll fashion a rope lead. When we're in town or near people, I'll keep it attached. But I won't collar him, and I won't chain him. The lead will be loose enough that he can choose to walk away if he wants. If that's not good enough, then maybe I need to leave Redemption Creek." Whitmore looked pained. "You just got here, and this is the first time in years I've seen you care about something beyond just getting through the day. I don't want you to leave. Then help me convince the town that Ghost isn't a threat." The compromise was announced at the next town meeting. Elias attended, with Ghost waiting outside in the wagon, a concession that had taken considerable negotiation. He stood before the assembled townspeople and explained his position clearly and without embellishment. "I understand your concerns," he said. "You don't know this animal. You don't know what he's capable of. But I'm asking you to give us a chance. Ghost was abused and broken, same as any creature can be broken. What I'm trying to do is show him that not all humans are cruel, that trust is possible, that healing can happen. If you can't support that, I'll respect your decision and move on. But I believe this town is better than that." There was silence after he finished. Then Martha stood up from her seat near the back. "I've seen them together," she said. "I've watched Elias with that wolf every day for 2 weeks now. And what I see isn't dangerous, it's decent. It's a man trying to do right by a creature that's been done wrong by too many others. If we turn him away for that, what does that say about us?" Doc Harrison stood next. "I've examined the wolf from a safe distance. He shows no signs of rabies or uncontrolled aggression. His behavior has been consistently non-threatening to humans. From a medical standpoint, I see no reason to demand his removal." One by one, others rose to speak. Jonas Mitchell talked about Elias's character and work ethic. The school teacher, Miss Peterson, mentioned how the children had learned compassion from watching Elias's patience with Ghost. Even a few of the ranch owners admitted that, while concerned, they'd seen no actual evidence of threat when the vote came. It was closer than Elias had hoped, but still decisive. He could keep Ghost, with the conditions that the wolf be supervised in town and that any signs of aggression be immediately reported. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The rope lead Elias fashioned was 20 feet of soft hemp, attached to a simple leather strap that looped loosely around Ghost's neck. The wolf tolerated it with resigned patience, seeming to understand it was necessary theater for the humans watching. But Elias kept his promise. The lead was never tight, never used to force Ghost anywhere he didn't want to go. They began taking walks through town in the early morning, when the streets were mostly empty. Ghost would heel beside Elias without needing the lead at all, his pace matching his companion's almost perfectly. People would watch from windows and doorways, marveling at the sight of man and wolf moving together in such easy synchronicity. But not everyone was won over. Luther Hayes, who owned the largest ranch in the valley, remained vocally opposed to Ghost's presence. He was a hard man who'd made his fortune through ruthless business practices and wasn't inclined towards sentiment about animals. "That beast killed 2 men in Colorado," he said to anyone who'd listen. "What's to stop him from killing here?" "Crane made up that story," Elias replied when the accusation reached him. "He admitted as much to me when I bought Ghost. Said he found the wolf caught in a trap and starving, made up the rest to draw crowds." But Hayes wasn't interested in truth when fear was more useful. He began spreading rumors, suggesting Ghost had been spotted near his cattle, claiming he'd heard howling in the night that frightened his horses. None of it was true, but truth mattered less than the fear it generated. The situation came to a head 3 weeks after the town meeting. Elias was working at the mill when Jonas Mitchell pulled him aside, his expression grim. "Luther Hayes was here this morning. Demanded I fire you, said he won't do business with anyone who employs the Wolfman. I told him where he could stick his demands, but Elias, he's not going to let this go. Men like him don't, I know. Elias had dealt with men like Hayes during the war, officers who cared more about their own authority than the mission, who'd sacrifice good men to protect their pride. "What do you want me to do?" "Nothing. Stand your ground. You've done nothing wrong, and I'll be damned if I let Luther Hayes dictate who I hire." Mitchell clapped him on the shoulder. "But watch yourself, and watch Ghost. Hayes isn't above manufacturing a crisis to get what he wants." That evening, Elias sat in the barn with Ghost and thought about patterns repeating. During the war, there had always been men who thrived on conflict, who couldn't abide peace or healing because it diminished their importance. Hayes was one of those men, and he'd found in Ghost a perfect target for his need to control and dominate. "Seems we've both got scars people can see," Elias told Ghost. "And scars they can't. The visible ones heal quicker. It's the invisible ones that keep causing trouble." Ghost rested his head on Elias's knee, a gesture of trust that still amazed him every time it happened. The wolf had filled out considerably in the past weeks. His coat was regaining its luster, the worst of his wounds had scabbed over and were healing cleanly, and there was a brightness in his eyes that spoke of recovering vitality. But more than physical healing, something else had changed. Ghost no longer flinched at sudden sounds. He'd stopped checking every shadow for threats. He actually played chasing, falling leaves in the yard and pouncing on field. Mice with puppyish enthusiasm that seemed at odds with his scarred body and ancient eyes. Watching him rediscover joy was like watching a miracle unfold in slow motion. And Elias realized, with something approaching wonder, that he was changing too. The numbness he'd cultivated for so long was cracking, letting in light and feeling and the dangerous possibility of hope. He'd started sleeping better, the nightmares less frequent. He'd accepted an invitation to dinner at Martha's table instead of eating alone in his room. He'd even smiled, really smiled, when one of the children asked if he'd teach them to carve wood like he did. Small changes, but significant. The kind of changes that suggested healing wasn't just something that happened to broken wolves, but to broken men as well. "Tomorrow," Elias said, scratching behind Ghost's ears, "we're going to walk through town at midday. No more hiding in the early morning. I want people to see you as you really are, not as Hayes makes you out to be. What do you think about that?" Ghost's tail gave a single, solid thump against the floor, the closest thing to a wag Elias had seen yet. It wasn't exactly enthusiasm, but it wasn't refusal either. It was partnership. And that, Elias thought, was something worth fighting for. The midday walk through town became their daily ritual. At first, people gave them a wide berth, crossing the street or ducking into shops when they saw Elias and Ghost approaching. But gradually, as days passed without incident, curiosity began to overcome fear. Children were the bravest. Young Emma Patterson approached first, her hand clutched tight in her mother's, asking in a whisper if she could pet the wolf. Elias had looked at Ghost, who'd looked back with what might have been resignation or might have been permission. The little girl's hand, so small against Ghost's massive head, had trembled as she touched the soft fur. Then she'd giggled with delight, and Ghost's tail had given that single thump that meant contentment. After that, others followed. Not everyone. Some folks would always see Ghost as a threat, but enough that the wolf was becoming a familiar presence rather than a frightening anomaly. Elias had taken to carving during their rest stops, his hands needing something to do while Ghost dozed in whatever shade they found. One afternoon, working on a piece of maple, he'd shaped something like a whistle, hollow and simple with a sound that carried far but wasn't harsh. When he blew into it experimentally, Ghost's ears had pricked forward with interest. "What do you think?" Elias asked, turning the whistle over in his hands. "Could be useful. A way to call you if we get separated." He'd tested it that evening, sending Ghost ahead on their walk and then blowing a pattern, 3 short notes followed by 1 long. Ghost had stopped immediately, turned, and trotted back to Elias's side. They'd practiced for a week until the response became automatic, a language between them that needed no words. But not everyone saw this growing bond as something positive. Luther Hayes's opposition had hardened into active hostility. He'd filed a complaint with Sheriff Whitmore claiming Ghost had attacked one of his calves, a lie so transparent it was almost insulting, but one that required investigation nonetheless. Whitmore had examined the calf in question and found wounds consistent with coyote attack, not wolf. The timeline didn't work either. Ghost had been with Elias at the mill during the hours in question, with multiple witnesses to confirm it. But Hayes wasn't interested in facts. He was interested in building a case, one fabrication at a time. He's going to force a confrontation, Whitmore warned Elias, and when he does, you need to be ready to walk away. Don't give him the excuse he's looking for. I won't, Elias promised. But he could feel the tension building like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and approaching fast. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning in mid-October. Elias and Ghost were walking back from the creek, the wolf carrying a stick he'd found and seemed inordinately pleased with, when they encountered Hayes on the road. The rancher was on horseback, flanked by two of his men, blocking the path deliberately. Hart, Hayes said, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. I'm giving you one last chance. Get rid of that animal, or I'll do it for you. Elias kept his voice calm and steady. Ghost is mine, legally purchased and properly cared for. You have no authority over him or me. I have the authority of common sense and public safety. That beast is dangerous, and everyone knows it. Everyone knows. You've been spreading lies, Elias corrected. That calf wasn't touched by Ghost, and you know it. This isn't about safety, it's about control. You don't like that something in this town exists outside your influence. Hayes's face flushed red. You want to make this personal? Fine. I've got friends in the territorial legislature. One word from me and Sheriff Whitmore will have no choice but to destroy that animal. Then I guess you'd better send that word. Because I'm not backing down. For a moment, Elias thought Hayes might actually draw his sidearm. The rancher's hand moved toward his hip, his men tensing in response. Ghost sensed the shift in atmosphere and dropped his stick, moving to stand between Elias and the mounted men. His body language protective but not aggressive. Easy, Elias said softly, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Ghost or Hayes. The standoff might have escalated into violence if Doc Harrison hadn't appeared from around the bend, his medical bag in hand. Gentlemen, he said mildly, as if stumbling upon armed men facing each other was an everyday occurrence. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. The presence of a witness diffused the tension. Hayes pulled his hand away from his gun and forced something like a smile onto his face. Just having a discussion about public safety, Doc. I see. Well, I'm sure Elias is taking every precaution. He's always struck me as an extremely responsible man. Doc's tone was pleasant, but his eyes were sharp behind his spectacles. In fact, I was just coming to check on Ghost's healing progress. Would you mind if I accompanied you back to the barn, Elias? Not at all. Hayes wheeled his horse around with more force than necessary, his men following. As they rode off, he called back, This isn't over, Hart, not by a long shot. That man is going to cause serious trouble, Doc said once they were out of earshot. I know. Is Ghost worth it? Worth potentially losing your job, your place in this community, maybe even your life? Elias looked down at the wolf walking beside him, stick retrieved and carried proudly once more. Ghost glanced up at him with those golden eyes, and something passed between them, understanding, loyalty, the kind of bond that couldn't be explained to someone who hadn't felt it. Yeah, Elias said simply. He's worth it. Back at the barn, Doc conducted his examination while Elias watched. Ghost tolerated the poking and prodding with patient dignity, only growling once when Doc pressed too hard on an old injury. Remarkable recovery, Doc said, straightening up and cleaning his hands. Another few weeks, and he'll be completely healed, physically at least. The psychological wounds, well, those take longer. But I'd say he's doing better than I expected. We both are, Elias admitted. Doc studied him thoughtfully. You know, when you first arrived in Redemption Creek, I thought you were a man waiting to die. Not actively suicidal, but not particularly invested in living either. You were just going through the motions. That's about right, but now Doc gestured toward Ghost. Now you're fighting for something. That's a significant change. Funny how that works. You spend years convinced you're better off alone, that caring about anything is just inviting more pain. Then a half-dead wolf looks at you with understanding, and suddenly, Elias shook his head. Suddenly you remember why you kept breathing all those years. Not for yourself, but for the possibility that eventually you might find something worth protecting again. And if Hayes forces you to choose between staying here and keeping Ghost safe, there's no choice to make. I'll leave. I've left places before. I'm good at it. But you don't want to. No, Elias admitted. For the first time in a decade, I don't want to leave. This place, these people, Martha and you and Tom and even the children who sneak around trying to see Ghost, it's starting to feel like something I thought I'd lost. Like home. Doc packed his medical bag slowly, his expression thoughtful. Then maybe it's time to fight for that feeling instead of running from it. Hayes expects you to back down because that's what men like him rely on, people being too tired or too scared to stand their ground. But you're not most people, Elias. You fought in a war, survived horrors that would break lesser men, and came out the other side still capable of compassion and care. Don't let one bitter rancher take that away from you. After Doc left, Elias sat with Ghost and thought about fighting and running, about homes and the courage it took to claim them. He carved while he thought, his knife moving automatically over the wood, shapes emerging that he hadn't consciously planned. When he finally looked at what he'd made, he found he'd carved a wolf, not Ghost exactly, but something like him. Strong and scarred, head raised toward an unseen horizon, posture suggesting not aggression but watchfulness, protection. We're going to see this through, he told Ghost, setting the carving on a shelf where it could watch over them both. Whatever Hayes throws at us, we'll face it together. Because that's what Pack does. They protect each other. Ghost's response was to rest his head on Elias's leg, a gesture so trusting it made Elias's chest tight. How many times during the war had he wished for just one creature, human or otherwise, who would trust him completely, who would choose to stay beside him not out of duty or fear, but out of genuine bond. And now he had that. Against all odds, in the most unlikely circumstances, he'd found exactly what he'd been missing. He wasn't going to let Hayes or anyone else take it away. That night, Elias did something he hadn't done in years. He pulled the cavalry saber from beneath his bed, unwrapped the oilcloth, and held the weapon in his hands. It was still in good condition. He'd maintained it out of habit, even though he'd sworn never to use it again. The blade caught the lamplight, showing the nicks and scratches of old battles. He'd carried this weapon through some of the worst fighting of the war. It had saved his life more than once, and taken others more times than he could count. Holding it now brought back memories he'd rather forget. Blood and screaming, the chaos of cavalry charges, the weight of men's lives in his hands. But it also reminded him of something else, that he was capable of more than just surviving. That when pushed, when something worth protecting was threatened, he could still fight. He wrapped the saber back in its cloth and returned it to its hiding place. He hoped he wouldn't need it. But if Hayes pushed this to violence, if the choice came down to Ghost's life or backing down, well, Elias had already made his choice. He'd made it the moment he bought a wolf everyone said was beyond saving, and nothing that happened since had made him regret it. Outside, the October wind rattled the barn walls. Ghost raised his head, listening to sounds Elias couldn't hear, then settled back down with a soft sigh. Whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever confrontations were coming, tonight they were safe. Tonight they were together, and for now, that was enough. The telegram arrived on a grey morning 3 days after the confrontation with Hayes. Sheriff Whitmore brought it to the mill personally, his expression grave enough that Elias knew immediately it was serious. "It's from the Territorial Marshal's office," Whitmore said, handing over the folded paper. "Hayes made good on his threat. He contacted his friends in Helena, and they're sending someone to investigate your dangerous animal situation." Elias read the telegram twice, his jaw tightening with each pass. An official inquiry meant official consequences. If the Marshal's representative deemed Ghost a threat, They'd have legal authority to destroy him, and there would be nothing Elias could do about it. When? He asked. 3 days. Maybe 4 if the weather slows them down. Whitmore removed his hat and ran a hand through his thinning hair. Elias, I'm sorry. I tried to head this off, sent my own report saying Ghost has been perfectly well behaved. But Hayes has influence I don't. You need to prepare for the possibility that this won't go your way. I won't let them kill him. Then you're talking about running, about becoming a fugitive. Whitmore's voice was heavy with concern. Is that really what you want? To throw away everything you've built here over a wolf? It's not just a wolf, Tom. You know that. I know you've formed an attachment. But Elias, think clearly about this. Where would you go? How would you survive with a wolf in tow? Most places won't be as tolerant as Redemption Creek has been, and you'd be looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life. Elias didn't have good answers to those questions. He'd spent that night lying awake, Ghost curled up on the floor beside his borrowed bed, an arrangement Martha had reluctantly permitted when it became clear the wolf wouldn't sleep unless he could see Elias. In the darkness, listening to Ghost's steady breathing, Elias had tried to imagine a path forward that didn't end in loss. He couldn't find one, but the next morning brought something unexpected. Emma Patterson arrived at the barn with her mother, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. The little girl was crying, and her mother looked nearly as distraught. "Mr. Hart," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice trembling. "We heard about the telegram. About what might happen to Ghost, and we both wanted, to do something." She pulled back the cloth to reveal dozens of folded papers, each one covered in careful handwriting, signatures, testimonials. "We went door to door last night," Mrs. Patterson explained. "Asked everyone to write down their honest feelings about Ghost, about whether they felt threatened by him or whether they'd seen any evidence he was dangerous. Emma wouldn't sleep until we'd talked to at least 50 families. Emma stepped forward, her small face fierce despite the tears. "Ghost is good," she said with the absolute certainty of childhood. "He's nice to me. He let me pet him, and he was gentle. Bad things shouldn't happen to good animals." Elias knelt down to Emma's level, something tight and warm, expanding in his chest. "Thank you," he said softly. "This means more than you know." Over the next 2 days, more testimonials arrived. Doc Harrison wrote a detailed medical and behavioral assessment. Martha penned an impassioned letter about compassion and second chances. Even Jonas Mitchell, not given to flowery language, wrote simply, "Ghost is no more dangerous than any creature protecting what it loves." That's not aggression, it's loyalty. But the most surprising addition came from an unexpected source. Elias was reading through the testimonials when Sheriff Whitmore appeared with another telegram, this one distinctly different from the first. "This came through the Helena office," Whitmore said, looking almost as shocked as Elias felt. "It's a follow-up to an inquiry I sent out. About Augustus Crane." Elias unfolded the telegram and read, "Augustus Crane wanted in Colorado Territory. Stop multiple charges, including animal cruelty and fraud. Stop wolf in question. Never killed anyone. Stop animal stolen from rancher near. Denver. Stop original owner deceased. Stop wolf. Raised from pup as livestock guardian. Stop trained. Not to harm humans. Stop reward posted for Crane's arrest." Stop. The words blurred as Elias read them again. Ghost wasn't a wild killer. He'd been raised by humans, trained to protect rather than attack. Everything Crane had said was a lie, designed to generate fear and profit. And Ghost had endured abuse and captivity despite having been conditioned his entire life to trust humans. Sweet mercy. Whitmore breathed. No wonder he's been so tolerant. He was never wild in the first place. He was domesticated and then tortured into appearing dangerous. Elias felt something break open inside him. Not grief exactly, but a profound rage at the injustice of it. Ghost had done everything right. He'd been loyal and protective and good, and he'd been betrayed for it. Stolen from his home, beaten and starved, displayed as a monster when he'd only ever tried to be what he was trained to be. "This changes everything," Whitmore said. "A trained livestock guardian isn't a wild animal. His property, or was. With the original owner deceased and no heirs claiming him, your purchase from Crane is legitimate. The marshal's inquiry might still happen, but this evidence completely undermines Hayes's position. Where's Crane now? No idea. The warrant was issued 2 months ago, but he's good at disappearing. Whitmore studied Elias's face. What are you thinking? I'm thinking Ghost deserves better than he got. From Crane, from me when I doubted him, from everyone who looked at him and saw only a threat instead of a victim. That afternoon, Elias sat with Ghost and told him everything. About the telegram, about his true history, about the rancher who'd raised him and the peaceful life he'd been stolen from. Ghost listened with his head tilted as if understanding. And when Elias's voice broke on the words, "I'm sorry," the wolf pressed his nose against Elias's hand in what could only be interpreted as forgiveness. "You were already good," Elias said, scratching behind Ghost's ears. "I didn't make you good. I just stopped people from making you worse." The revelation transformed the town's perception overnight. The story spread quickly. Ghost wasn't a wild predator, but a trained guardian, stolen and abused. People who'd been frightened now felt sympathy. Those who'd been skeptical became advocates. Even some of Hayes's supporters began questioning his crusade against an animal who'd never been a legitimate threat. But Hayes himself only grew more entrenched. When confronted with the new information, he dismissed it as fabrication. "Convenient timing," he sneered to anyone who'd listen. "Hart probably sent that telegram himself." The claim was absurd. The telegram had come through official channels and included verification codes. But Hayes had invested too much in his position to back down now. His opposition was no longer about public safety. It was about saving face. 2 days before the marshal's representative was due to arrive, Hayes made his move. His men spread word that several sheep from a neighboring ranch had been killed in the night, the wounds consistent with wolf attack. The rancher in question, a man named Porter who owed Hayes money, backed the claim despite having no actual evidence. Sheriff Whitmore investigated and found the same thing he'd found with the calf: coyote kills, not wolf. The timeline didn't work either. Ghost had been with Elias all night, sleeping in his room at Martha's. But the accusation served its purpose. It created doubt, just as support for Ghost was building. "He's forcing the issue," Doc Harrison said at an emergency gathering in Martha's parlor. "He knows that telegram undermines his position, so he's manufacturing crises to counteract it. The question is, what's his endgame?" Whitmore mused. "He's got to know he can't win this anymore, not with the evidence stacking against him." Martha set down her teacup with more force than necessary. "Men like Luther Hayes don't think about winning or losing. They think about dominating. As long as he can make Elias's life difficult, as long as he can maintain that he was right to oppose Ghost, he'll consider it a victory." "So what do we do?" Jonas Mitchell asked. Everyone looked at Elias, who'd been silent throughout the discussion. He sat in the corner, Ghost lying at his feet, and thought about patterns repeating. He'd seen this before, during the war, in mining camps, on cattle drives. There was always one man who needed conflict, who thrived on it, who'd rather burn everything down than admit he was wrong. "We wait for the marshal's representative," Elias said finally. "We present the evidence, the testimonials, the telegram about Crane, Doc's medical reports, everything, and we let an impartial party make the decision. And if they decide against Ghost," Martha asked gently. Elias met her eyes, and in them she saw a determination she'd never quite seen before. "Then I'll do what I should have been willing to do from the start. I'll take Ghost somewhere he can be safe, even if that means leaving everything else behind." "You'd really give up what you've found here? Community, friendship, a place to belong." "I gave up on belonging a long time ago, Martha. What I've found with Ghost, that's different. That's not about geography or community. That's about keeping a promise to something that can't protect itself against human cruelty and indifference." He looked down at the wolf, whose golden eyes reflected the lamplight. "I failed to protect what mattered once before. I won't make that mistake again." The room fell quiet. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the windows like a coded message. Ghost lifted his head at the sound, listening to something only he could hear, then settled back down with a soft exhale. In 2 days, the marshal's representative would arrive. In 2 days, Elias would learn whether the law would protect the bond he'd formed or destroy it. But tonight, in Martha's warm parlor surrounded by people who'd become something like friends, with a wolf who'd become something like salvation resting against his leg, Elias allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in years: hope, dangerous, fragile and absolutely necessary. Hope that maybe, just maybe, doing the right thing would be enough. Deputy Marshal Sarah Blackwood arrived on the morning stage, and she wasn't what anyone expected. She was younger than Elias by at least a decade, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a bearing that suggested she'd dealt with men like Hayes before. The territorial marshal's badge pinned to her vest gleamed in the autumn sunlight as she stepped down from the coach, a leather document case tucked under one arm. "Sheriff Whitmore," she said, extending her hand. "Deputy Marshal Blackwood, I trust you received word of my arrival." "We did, ma'am." "Welcome to Redemption Creek." Whitmore shook her hand firmly, respect evident in his posture. "I've prepared all the documentation you requested, plus additional materials that have come to light since the initial complaint." "Good. I'd like to review everything before I make any preliminary assessments." She glanced around the street, where townsfolk had gathered to watch her arrival. "I assume the animal in question is nearby?" "With his owner. I can take you there whenever you're ready. Give me an hour to settle in and review the files. Then we'll proceed." That hour felt like the longest of Elias's life. He spent it in the barn with Ghost, going through their morning routine as if repetition could somehow ward off the coming judgment. He brushed Ghost's coat until it shone, cleaned the barn until every surface gleamed, organized the testimonial letters for the 10th time. Busy work, all of it, but it kept his hands occupied and his mind from spiraling into dark possibilities. Ghost seemed to sense his anxiety. The wolf stayed close, pressing against Elias's leg whenever he stood still for more than a moment, offering the kind of silent support that needed no words. "Whatever happens," Elias said quietly, "I want you to know you saved me as much as I saved you. Maybe more." When Sheriff Whitmore arrived with Deputy Marshal Blackwood, Elias had composed himself into something resembling calm. He stood at the barn entrance with Ghost sitting beside him, both of them presenting as non-threatening, but not submissive. "Mr. Hart." Blackwood approached with measured steps, her eyes cataloguing everything: his posture, Ghost's behavior, the condition of the barn. "I'm Deputy Marshal Blackwood. I'm here to investigate a complaint filed by Luther Hayes regarding a dangerous animal allegedly under your control." "Ghost isn't dangerous," Elias said evenly. "But I understand you need to make that determination yourself. I appreciate your cooperation." She stopped about 10 feet away, close enough to observe, but far enough to maintain safety protocols. "That's the wolf in question?" "Yes, ma'am." "This is Ghost." For several long moments, Blackwood simply watched. Ghost returned her gaze without aggression, his ears forward and his body relaxed. When she took a slow step closer, he didn't retreat or tense. Another step and still no reaction beyond mild curiosity. "May I approach him directly?" "You can try, but I won't force him. Ghost makes his own decisions about who he trusts." "Fair enough." Blackwood moved forward with the confidence of someone who'd dealt with animals before, stopping just out of Ghost's immediate range. She crouched down, making herself smaller, and extended one hand palm down for Ghost to sniff. Ghost looked at Elias as if asking permission. When Elias gave a small nod, the wolf stood and approached Blackwood cautiously. He sniffed her hand, her sleeve, taking his time to assess this new human. Then, to everyone's surprise, he sat down directly in front of her and offered his paw. Blackwood's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but something close. She took the offered paw gently. "Well trained," she observed. "This isn't wild animal behavior." "No, ma'am. We recently learned Ghost was raised as a livestock guardian before he was stolen and abused by a traveling showman. There's documentation of that in the materials Sheriff Whitmore provided." "I saw." "Augustus Crane, There's an active warrant for his arrest in 3 territories now." She released Ghost's paw and stood. "Mr. Hart, I'd like to observe Ghost in various situations. Around other people, around animals if possible, in circumstances that might trigger aggressive behavior. Can you facilitate that?" "Yes, ma'am." Over the next 3 hours, Deputy Marshal Blackwood conducted the most thorough examination Elias could have imagined. She watched Ghost interact with Martha, with Doc Harrison, with Jonas Mitchell. She observed him around the children who'd come to see him, Emma Patterson first, then others emboldened by her example. She had Elias walk Ghost through town, noting how he healed without need for the rope lead, how he ignored barking dogs and skittish horses with patient indifference. She interviewed townspeople, asking pointed questions about Ghost's behavior, any incidents or near incidents, their honest assessment of threat level. The testimonial letters were read carefully, cross-referenced with verbal accounts. Doc Harrison's medical reports were scrutinized with professional thoroughness. Through it all, Ghost was calm and cooperative, as if understanding that his life depended on good behavior. He didn't growl, didn't show teeth, didn't display any of the aggression Hayes had claimed was inherent and dangerous. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Hayes," Blackwood said as afternoon stretched toward evening. "He filed the complaint, so I need his direct testimony." Luther Hayes arrived at the sheriff's office within an hour of being summoned, flanked by his 2 ranch hands. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he held the winning cards. But Elias noticed the slight tightness around his eyes when he saw Deputy Marshal Blackwood reviewing documents at Whitmore's desk. "Deputy Marshal," Hayes said with exaggerated courtesy, "I trust you've seen enough to understand why I filed this complaint. That animal is a clear and present danger to this community." "What I've seen," Blackwood said without looking up from the document she was reading, "is a well-behaved, well-trained livestock guardian who's shown zero aggression toward humans despite significant provocation and past abuse." "What I haven't seen is any evidence to support your claims." Hayes's expression hardened. "The evidence is in his nature. He's a wolf, a predator. Just because he hasn't attacked yet doesn't mean he won't. By that logic, we should eliminate all predators, including humans, since we're historically the most dangerous predators on the planet." Now Blackwood looked up, her gaze level and unyielding. "Mr. Hayes, I've read the complaint you filed. You claim this wolf killed livestock, specifically a calf and several sheep. Sheriff Whitmore's investigations found those claims to be demonstrably false. The wounds weren't consistent with wolf attack, and Mr. Hart had documented alibis for both incidents. His word against mine. Multiple witnesses against your unsupported accusations. There's a difference." She set down the document and stood. "Mr. Hayes, I've been a deputy marshal for 8 years. In that time I've dealt with actual dangerous animals, including several wolves. I know what threat behavior looks like. I know how to assess risk, and nothing I've observed about Ghost suggests he's dangerous to humans. In fact, given his training and temperament, I'd judge him considerably less threatening than many domestic dogs I've encountered." "That's your professional opinion?" "It is." Hayes's jaw worked as if chewing something bitter. "And what about the will of the community? The people who are concerned for their safety?" "I've interviewed over 30 residents of Redemption Creek. 27 expressed no concerns about Ghost. Of the 3 who did express concerns, 2 admitted they'd never actually encountered the animal and were basing their fears on rumors that seemed to originate primarily with you. The 3rd was your associate, Mr. Porter, who has since recanted his statement about the sheep kills. When pressed on details, he couldn't provide. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of Whitmore's desk clock. Elias watched Hayes's face cycle through emotions, anger, frustration, calculation, before settling on cold determination. "You're making a mistake," Hayes said quietly. "That creature is dangerous, and when someone gets hurt, and they will get hurt, it'll be on your head, Deputy Marshal. If anyone is injured by Ghost, Mr. Hayes, I'll revisit my assessment. But until such time as actual evidence of dangerous behavior presents itself, I see no legal justification for destroying a trained working animal who's shown consistent good temperament." Blackwood pulled out a form from her document case and began filling it in with precise, efficient strokes. I'm ruling that Ghost poses no immediate threat to public safety and may remain under Mr. Hart's care, provided Mr. Hart maintains reasonable precautions and supervision. She signed the form with a flourish and stamped it with her official seal. The sound of the stamp hitting paper felt like a door closing on one chapter and opening on another. Hayes stood motionless for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the office, his men following. The door closed behind them with ominous finality. "That man is not going to let this go," Doc Harrison said quietly. He'd been watching from the corner, his expression troubled. "He's been publicly contradicted and overruled. Men like him, they don't forgive that kind of humiliation." "I know," Blackwood said. "Which is why I'm staying in town for a few more days. Just to ensure the transition to the new status quo goes smoothly. You think Hayes will try something?" "I think Hayes is the type who'd rather be feared than respected, and he's just been shown that his fear tactics don't work on territorial law. Whether that makes him back down or double down," she shrugged. "That's what I'm here to find out." That evening, there was a celebration of sorts at Martha's boarding house. She'd insisted on hosting dinner for everyone who'd supported Elias and Ghost through the ordeal. The table was crowded with townspeople. Doc Harrison, Jonas Mitchell, Sheriff Whitmore, Emma Patterson and her mother, even Miss Peterson, the schoolteacher. Ghost lay beside Elias's chair, occasionally accepting treats slipped to him by children who'd overcome their fear. The atmosphere was warm with relief and camaraderie, with the particular kind of joy that comes from collective effort resulting in justice. But Elias found it hard to fully join in. He kept thinking about Hayes's expression as he'd left the sheriff's office, not defeated but calculating, planning something. "You did it," Martha said softly, sitting down beside him with 2 cups of coffee. "Ghost is safe. You can stop worrying. Hayes isn't finished, maybe not, but he's been officially ruled against. What can he do? I don't know. That's what worries me." Outside, the October night had turned cold, the first real hint of the winter to come. Somewhere in the darkness, Luther Hayes was nursing his grievances and plotting his next move. And Elias, who'd seen enough of men and war to recognize when conflict was truly over versus when it was just pausing to catch its breath, knew with absolute certainty that the hardest test was still ahead. He reached down to scratch behind Ghost's ears, feeling the solid warmth of the wolf against his leg. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. That would have to be enough. The attack came on the 3rd night after Deputy Marshal Blackwood's ruling. Elias woke to Ghost's low, warning growl, a sound he'd never heard from the wolf before. It was barely past midnight, the barn dark except for slivers of moonlight through the wall slats. "What is it, boy?" Elias whispered, reaching for his boots. Ghost was at the barn door, hackles raised, his entire body tense with alertness. Elias moved to join him, pressing his ear against the wood and listening. Voices, multiple men, trying and failing to be quiet. The sharp chemical smell of kerosene. His blood went cold. They were going to burn the barn. He had seconds to make a decision. The barn's front door was the only proper exit. The back wall had gaps wide enough for Ghost to squeeze through, but they'd be exposed and vulnerable escaping that way. And if Hayes's men were smart, they'd have that route covered anyway. "Stay quiet," Elias murmured to Ghost. He grabbed the cavalry saber from its hiding place beneath his cot, unwrapping it for the first time in years. The familiar weight settled into his hand, like memory made solid. He could hear them now, right outside. At least 3 men, maybe 4. The splash of liquid against dry wood, someone laughing nervously. Then Luther Hayes's voice, unmistakable even in a whisper, "Make sure the door's blocked. I want Hart to have a choice. Come out and face charges for attacking us, or stay in and burn with his pet monster." Elias understood the plan immediately. Hayes couldn't legally destroy Ghost anymore, so he'd create a situation where Elias was the aggressor. He'd claim they'd come to talk, that Elias had attacked them, that the fire was accidental or self-defense. 3 or 4 witnesses to support the lie, and Elias's word alone against them. It was clever. It was exactly the kind of trap a desperate man with resources would set. But Hayes had made one critical miscalculation. He'd assumed Elias was the same broken, passive man who drifted into Redemption Creek, looking for nothing more than a place to quietly exist until he died. That man might have accepted this fate, might have walked into the trap with resignation. Elias wasn't that man anymore. "Get ready," he told Ghost softly. "When I open this door, you run. Don't fight, don't protect me, just run to town." "Fine, Tom, understand." Ghost whined softly, pressing against his leg in refusal. "I know, but I need you safe and I can handle this." He stroked the wolf's head once, firmly. "This is my fight, not yours." Outside, someone struck a match. The smell of smoke began seeping through the wall cracks. Elias gripped the saber, took a breath to center himself, and kicked open the barn door with explosive force. The door caught Hayes's man, Jessup, one of his ranch hands, square in the chest, sending him sprawling backward. The burning torch he'd been holding flew from his hand, landing in the dry grass. 2 other men stood frozen in shock at the sudden appearance of Elias with drawn blade. Hayes himself stood 20 feet back, mounted on his horse, safely out of immediate danger. "Elias Hart," Hayes called out, his voice carrying theatrical surprise. "What's the meaning of this attack? We came here peacefully to discuss your wolf situation, and you come out armed and violent. Save it for someone who hasn't seen this play before." Elias cut him off. He kicked at the torch, sending it away from the barn before the fire could spread. "You came here to murder me and Ghost and make it look justified. I'm guessing your men are prepared to swear I attacked first." "That's exactly what happened," Jessup wheezed, climbing to his feet. "Then why do you smell like kerosene? Why is there accelerant splashed on my barn door?" Elias's voice was flat, deadly calm. "You made a mistake, Hayes. You let your pride override your judgment again. You're threatening me with a weapon. That's assault with intent. No, this is self-defense. There's a difference, and a territorial court will see it clearly." Elias took a step forward, the saber reflecting moonlight. "But here's what's going to happen. You and your men are going to leave now. You're going to abandon this vendetta against Ghost, and you're going to hope that Deputy Marshal Blackwood, who I'm certain will be very interested in hearing about this little incident, shows you more mercy than you deserve. You think you can threaten me? I own half this county, you own property. That's not the same as owning people's loyalty or respect." Elias took another step. Ghost had emerged from the barn and now stood beside him, a united front. "And the only thing you accomplished tonight was proving everything I said about you was true. You're a bully who'd rather destroy what you can't control than admit you might be wrong." Behind Hayes, more lights appeared. Lanterns, moving fast. Voices calling out. Someone had seen the commotion and raised the alarm. Sheriff Whitmore arrived at a run, gun drawn, with Doc Harrison and Jonas Mitchell close behind. Deputy Marshal Blackwood appeared moments later, still fastening her coat over her nightdress, but fully alert. "What in the hell is going on here?" Whitmore demanded. Everyone started talking at once, Hayes claiming peaceful intent and violent response, his men backing the story. Elias quiet, letting them dig their own grave with words. It was Blackwood who ended it. She walked to the barn door, knelt down, and touched the wood with her fingers. "They came away wet and reeking, kerosene," she said flatly. She stood and faced Hayes. "You want to explain to me why there's accelerant on Mr. Hart's barn door if your intentions were peaceful?" Hayes's expression went carefully blank. "I have no idea how that got there." "No? And the torch in the grass? The witnesses who'll testify to seeing you and your men approaching with burning implements?" She stepped closer to Hayes's horse. "Mr. Hayes, I'm placing you under arrest for attempted arson and conspiracy to commit murder. You can't prove. I can prove enough to make your life very difficult. And after the investigation I'm about to launch into your business practices and land dealings, I suspect arson will be the least of your legal troubles." She looked at his men. "Drop your weapons. Now." For a moment, Elias thought Hayes might actually be foolish enough to resist. But the rancher was many things: cruel, vindictive, arrogant, but not quite stupid enough to assault a federal officer. One by one, his men dropped their guns. Hayes dismounted with jerky, furious movements, his face red with humiliation and rage. "This isn't over," he hissed at Elias. "Yes," Elias said quietly. "It is." Deputy Marshal Blackwood took Hayes and his men into custody that night. By morning, half the town had heard what happened, and by afternoon the other half had heard 3 different embellished versions. The truth, as always, was simpler and more damning than rumor. Hayes had attempted to burn down the barn with Elias and Ghost inside. He'd been caught in the act by a federal officer, and now he faced charges that would likely strip him of his freedom and reputation both. The investigation that followed revealed more than anyone expected. Hayes had been using intimidation and occasionally arson to force smaller ranchers to sell their land at below-market prices. He'd burned out at least 2 families in the past year, though he'd been careful enough that no one could prove it until now. Porter, the man who'd falsely claimed Ghost killed his sheep, came forward voluntarily once Hayes was in custody, admitting he'd lied under financial pressure. 20 years, Doc Harrison said, sitting with Elias at the creek 3 days later. That's how long Hayes has been doing this. Bullying, threatening, destroying anyone who stood in his way. And it took one stubborn man and a wolf to finally expose him. I wasn't trying to expose anything. I was just trying to protect Ghost. Sometimes that's all it takes. One person willing to stand firm against something wrong. Doc skipped a stone across the water's surface. You gave this town more than you know, Elias. You reminded us what it means to do the right thing, even when it's difficult. Ghost was splashing in the shallows, playing like Elias had never seen him play before. The wolf's joy was uncomplicated and pure, all traces of his traumatic past seemingly washed away by the clear, cold water. Watching him, Elias felt something settle in his chest, a peace he hadn't known he'd been seeking. "What are you going to do now?" Doc asked. "Hayes is in jail, Ghost is safe, and winter's coming. You could stay here, build something permanent. Lord knows Martha would be happy to have you as a long-term boarder. And Jonas mentioned he'd like to make you a partner in the mill if you're interested." "A partner. Says your craftsmanship is the best he's seen in 30 years. Says you've got an eye for quality that can't be taught." Doc smiled. "That's high praise from a man who doesn't give compliments lightly." Elias considered it. A partnership meant roots, meant committing to this place, these people, meant accepting that he wasn't just passing through anymore, but actually belonged somewhere. The idea still frightened him a little. But it was a good fear, the kind that came from having something worth losing again. "I'll think about it," he said, which was more commitment than he'd been able to make to anything in years. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, Elias sat on the barn's front step with Ghost beside him. The wolf's head rested on his knee, eyes half closed in contentment. They'd fallen into such easy companionship that it was hard to remember a time when they hadn't known each other. Martha approached carrying a covered basket, her expression warm. "I thought you boys might like some supper. Fresh bread, ham, and apple pie. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to." She set the basket down and studied them both, man and wolf, battered and scarred but healing. "You know what Emma Patterson said today? She said Ghost is like the storybook she reads about the ugly duckling. Everyone thought he was bad because he looked scary, but really he was just lonely and hurt. And now he's found his family out of the mouths of children," Elias murmured. "She's not wrong, though. You two found each other when you both needed it most. That's not coincidence, Elias. That's grace." After Martha left, Elias unwrapped the food and shared it with Ghost. The companionable silence broken only by the evening sounds of crickets and wind through grass. In the distance, lights were coming on in town, warm squares of yellow against the deepening blue of twilight. Sheriff Whitmore stopped by just after dark, his expression satisfied. "Thought you'd want to know. Deputy Marshal Blackwood is recommending Hayes face federal charges in addition to territorial ones. The arson, the intimidation, all of it. He'll be tied up in courts for years, and his ranch is already being placed in receivership. He's finished. Good. More than good. It's justice. Whitmore sat down beside him. You did something important here, my friend. You stood up to a bully when most folks just looked the other way. That takes courage. I was just protecting Ghost. You were protecting what was right. Sometimes they're the same thing. Whitmore stood, preparing to leave, then paused. Jonas told me he offered you a partnership. I hope you'll consider staying. Redemption Creek could use more men like you. After Whitmore left, Elias pulled out his carving knife and the piece of wood he'd been working on for weeks. The shape was finally clear now. A wolf and a man, side by side, facing toward an unseen horizon. Not separate entities, but a united pair, each incomplete without the other. What do you think? He asked Ghost, holding up the carving. Should we stay? Ghost's answer was to rest his head more firmly on Elias's knee, a gesture of trust and contentment that needed no translation. Elias looked up at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Catherine and Mary were up there somewhere, memories growing gentler with time. He'd loved them deeply, would always carry them with him. But he was learning that love didn't have a fixed capacity. It could expand to hold new connections without diminishing old ones. Yeah, he said softly, scratching behind Ghost's ears. I think we'll stay. Winter came to Redemption Creek with a gentleness unusual for Montana territory. The first snow fell on a Tuesday morning in late November, soft and quiet, transforming the rough frontier town into something almost beautiful. Elias stood at the window of his new room, not at Martha's boarding house anymore, but above the mill office where Jonas had set up living quarters for his new partner, and watched the flakes drift down like whispered promises. Ghost pressed his nose against the glass, breath fogging the pain. The wolf had never seen snow before, or at least had no memory of it from his early life. When Elias opened the door to let him out, Ghost bounded into the white landscape with the enthusiasm of a puppy, snapping at snowflakes and rolling in the accumulating powder. Watching him, Elias found himself laughing, actually laughing, a sound so unfamiliar in his own throat that it startled him. But it felt good, right, like a muscle that had atrophied from disuse, finally remembering its purpose. The partnership with Jonas had proven to be exactly what Elias needed. The work was steady and satisfying, turning raw lumber into useful things. Cabinets, tables, doors that hung straight and true. There was something deeply peaceful about creating rather than destroying, about building things meant to last. His hands, which had once held weapons and dealt death, now shaped wood into forms that brought comfort and utility to people's lives. The town had changed too. Or perhaps Elias was simply seeing it more clearly now. What he'd initially perceived as suspicious distance had revealed itself to be the natural caution of frontier people towards strangers. Once he'd proven himself, first through his defense of Ghost, then through his stand against Hayes, that caution had transformed into acceptance and eventually something warmer. Respect, friendship, belonging. Emma Patterson still visited every Saturday, bringing treats for Ghost and sitting in the mill yard while Elias worked. She'd talk about school, about books she was reading, about her dreams of becoming a teacher like Miss Peterson. Ghost would lie beside her, patient and gentle, occasionally accepting a scratch behind the ears or a piece of jerky from her pocket. The little girl who'd been too frightened to approach a caged wolf now considered him her particular friend, and Ghost, fierce, damaged Ghost, treated her with such careful tenderness it sometimes made Elias's eyes sting. Mr. Hart, she'd said last Saturday, her small face serious, do you think Ghost remembers being scared when he was in that cage? I think he remembers, Elias had replied carefully. But I also think he's learning that not all memories have to hurt forever. Sometimes they just become part of your story. Not the whole story, just a chapter that helped make you who you are. Like your war memories? The child's perception had caught him off guard, but he'd answered honestly. Yes, like those. She'd thought about that for a moment, then nodded as if filing the information away for future consideration. Children, Elias had discovered, understood more than adults gave them credit for. They saw clearly what adults often obscured with complications and justifications. Doc Harrison stopped by most afternoons, ostensibly to check on Ghost's continued health, but really because he enjoyed the company. They'd sit together in companionable silence, or talk about medicine or philosophy, or nothing in particular. The doctor never pressed Elias about his past, never demanded more than he was willing to share. It was a friendship built on mutual respect, and the understanding that some wounds healed better when left undisturbed. Martha still fed him, insisted on it, claiming his cooking was an affront to decent food everywhere. He'd take dinner at her table several nights a week, listening to the boarders' stories and occasionally contributing his own. She'd been right that first morning when she'd guessed what he was trying to do. He had been trying to save something he couldn't save before. But what he'd learned was that salvation worked both ways. Ghost had saved him just as surely as he'd saved Ghost. Sheriff Whitmore had become something like the brother Elias had never had. They'd take walks together on Sunday afternoons, Ghost trailing behind or ranging ahead, while they talked about the war, about guilt and forgiveness, about carrying on when carrying on seemed impossible. Tom had his own ghosts, men he'd led into battle who hadn't come back, decisions made in the chaos of combat that haunted him still. Finding someone who understood without judgment had been healing for them both. The carved wolf and man Elias had finished sat on a shelf in the mill office, a reminder of where he'd been and how far he'd come. Jonas had offered to buy it, said it would fetch a good price from travelers passing through. But Elias had refused. Some things weren't for sale. Some things were meant to be kept close, tangible proof that transformation was possible even for the most broken among us. On this snowy morning, Elias dressed warmly and headed outside to join Ghost in his play. The wolf greeted him with uncharacteristic exuberance, shaking snow from his thick coat and bounding in circles. They walked together toward town, following paths that had become deeply familiar. Past houses where people waved from windows and called out greetings. At the general store, Mr. Henderson had saved the best meat scraps for Ghost. At the church, Pastor Williams stopped his snow shoveling to chat about the upcoming Christmas service. At the schoolhouse, children pressed against the windows to wave at the wolf who'd become their town's unlikeliest mascot. This was home now. Not a place Elias was passing through or hiding in, but a place he'd chosen, and that had chosen him back. A place where his past didn't define him, where he could be more than the sum of his scars and regrets. They ended up at the creek, where the water ran dark against snow-covered banks. Ghost drank deeply, then settled beside Elias on a fallen log, content to simply exist in the moment, without need for purpose or productivity. "We did all right," Elias said quietly, stroking Ghost's head. "Didn't we, boy?" Two broken things that somehow figured out how to fit together. Ghost's tail thumped once against the snow. Approval. Agreement, or perhaps just acknowledgement, of a truth they both understood. Somewhere in the town behind them, a church bell chimed the hour. Smoke rose from chimneys, carrying the scent of wood fires and cooking food. Children's laughter echoed through the cold air. Life continuing, as it always did, with all its complications and small joys. Elias had spent a decade trying to escape himself, to outrun grief and guilt and the weight of memories too heavy to carry. But here, in this unlikely place with this unlikely companion, he'd learned a different truth. You couldn't outrun yourself. You could only learn to walk forward with your scars showing, trusting that healing wasn't about forgetting, but about finding purpose beyond the pain. He looked at Ghost, at the wolf who everyone had feared, who everyone said was too broken to save, who'd proven them all wrong, simply by surviving and choosing trust when every experience had taught him to choose violence. If Ghost could transform from caged monster to beloved friend, then maybe there was hope for scarred cavalry officers too. Maybe redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about writing new chapters that honored both what was lost and what was found. Maybe home wasn't a place you returned to, but a place you built, piece by piece, with patience and courage, and the willingness to try again, even when trying seemed impossible. The snow continued to fall, soft and steady, covering old tracks and creating space for new ones. Elias stood, brushing snow from his coat, and Ghost rose beside him. Together, they walked back toward town, toward the life they'd chosen and the people who'd chosen them back. Behind them, their footprints marked the snow in parallel lines, man and wolf, walking side by side toward whatever came next. Not separate journeys, but a single path, shared by two souls who'd recognized in each other something worth saving. And in that recognition, they'd both found what they'd been looking for all along. Not salvation from their pasts, but connection in their present. Not escape from themselves, but acceptance of who they'd become through trials endured and survived. Sometimes, Elias thought, the most broken souls really do recognize each other. And sometimes, if they're very lucky, they help each other heal.